What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your UFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at the second week of the United Football League spring season here in 2025. And we have a little bit more information that we can now use to make some decisions for our DraftKings daily fantasy lineups here in week 2 for the 4-game slate, the 2-game slate, and the single-game shutdown slates that we have this weekend coming up on Saturday evening and Sunday evening as well. First time with us, appreciate you being here. Repeat viewer, appreciate you being here as well. We have free projections for every single UFL game every single weekend available in our Discord for our Discord subscribers. So, if you are not yet a member of the Occupy Fantasy Discord, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. That comes with a free membership to the Discord channel. And then there is also a link to subscribe to the Discord directly if you choose to do so as well. Story of the week from week number 1, the DC Defenders with their big upset victory over the Birmingham Stallions in week number 1. Stallions' offensive line was not able to get things going in that game, and that really cost them on offense despite holding DC to just 18 points. We're kicking off week 4 with a matchup between the Stallions and the Michigan Panthers. It's actually a rematch of last year's USFL Conference Championship game between these two teams. And basically the big storyline here, guys, is whether or not Birmingham can get back in the win column and can protect Alex Magoo and keep him upright here this week. Skip Holtz did go on local Birmingham radio and confirm that he's not making any lineup changes this week. So we do have Alex Magoo expected to return under center for this game against Michigan. And for me, that is the biggest key to the first game on the weekend here. I do think Alex Magoo with his rushing upside, we saw that last week with the 84 rushing yards on 8 scrambles/rush attempts. That's going to give him a great floor week in and week out. Week 1 has the potential to be Alex Magoo's worst game of the season. Didn't complete a pass in the entire second half against DC. Still gave us 17 DraftKings points, which was one of the better scores for a quarterback on the week in week number 1. So I do think we still want to consider Alex Magoo heavily here in low-risk contests in week number 1. But on to the normal agenda of the show. First, favorite play ties into our biggest favorites. Sal Cannella had the best weighted opportunity role for a pass catcher in the entire UFL in week number 1. That's a combination of his target share and market share of the air yards from the quarterback in his offense. Cannella had 8 targets from Luis Perez in week 1 against the San Antonio Brahmas. And he also was good for just shy of 40% of Arlington's team air yards from quarterbacks. Now, Luis Perez didn't really push the ball tremendously far downfield, so just a 5.3-yard average depth of target for Sal Cannella in game number 1. However, if that is going to be how they choose to pass the football here, that's good news for Cannella to continue to see a ton of opportunities. Cannella priced efficiently at $8,600 should probably be featured pretty heavily, with Arlington being the biggest favorites this week. They are favored by 10 points in their matchup against the Houston Roughnecks this week, and they had a 3-headed monster at running back. So I do like to go into my favorite plays at running back based off of game scripts that are available to us. First thing that is probably surprising, our cheapest running back from Arlington is actually the running back that earned the most carries last week. He had 16 rush attempts out of 31 team carries for Arlington against the Brahmas. Was extremely inefficient, just 2.5 yards per carry. But at $5,500 here, I do think Day Hunter is worth taking some flyers on in a positive game script situation. The only risk here is we've kind of learned that last year's starter, De'Veon Smith, is legitimately the goal line back. 3 carries from the 1-yard line, 3 touchdowns last week against the San Antonio Brahmas. And then RB1 on the depth chart, Kalen Ballage, not a ton of touches, extremely efficient on them, however, against San Antonio last week. So I would expect Ballage to still be atop of the depth chart here, but I really do like the workload we saw for Day Hunter. So I think I would be interested in taking shots on him in the large field, mass multi-entry $20 shovel pass GPP this weekend here on DraftKings. Behind Arlington, talked about them to begin the video, the DC Defenders hosting the Memphis Showboats. Showboats are getting head coach Ken Wisenhunt back on the sideline this week, so that should probably boost the entire organization and give them some stability with the coaching staff, which is never a bad thing. Abram Smith, 2023's leading rusher in the XFL, 13 carries last week. A lot smaller of a share of touches in that backfield than I think we anticipated going into week number 1 for DC. That 13 carries was just 46% of team rushes. We were used to seeing Smith get like 60 to 70% in his time in the XFL. It was former Indianapolis Colt, former NFL player Deion Jackson behind him with 10 carries, good for about 37% of the team carries in game number 1, and 1 target in the passing game for Deion Jackson last week. 1 target for Abram Smith as well. So a relatively even split thus far between these two backs. I would say Smith is probably the better bet here in a positive game script situation. So the game against Birmingham was pretty close throughout the entire game. And also DC dropped back to pass almost 40 times. So it was not a very good running script for the defenders. If the defenders are able to get out to a big lead against Memphis here, I think Abram Smith is the one that will see the majority of the work. And you can take probably a low-owned shot at him at this price, which is near the salary ceiling. He's the second most expensive running back on this slate. Speaking of expensive running backs, the most expensive running back, Jacob Sailors, probably someone we should prioritize again here against San Antonio. 16 carries last week, 5 targets in the passing game, got in the end zone, just shy of 100 yards rushing, but this is the bona fide, true bell cow running back in the UFL. I do think it is slightly misleading that we have this 25.3-point box score result from Jarvie and Howard, because everybody that watched the games knows that came from one long 74-yard touchdown rush. So before that rush, he had 12 carries, 40 yards, a very modest showing in the box score. So one thing we can say with confidence is it does look like St. Louis was rotating series a little bit at times. Sailors would come off and Howard would get 3 to 4 plays in a row. So it does seem like that is definitely on the table and in play here for the Battlehawks throughout this season, that they use these guys as kind of a 1-2 punch. But I do think at this point, Sailors is by far the better play, but the salaries also reflect that. We have Howard at $6,000 versus $10,000 for Jacob Sailors, and I do think Howard's definitely playable with that big play upside that we saw last week. High risk only, I would say, though, this week for sure. Clearly the backup to Jacob Sailors. Finally, the closest game on the slate. Birmingham, despite the loss last week, despite going on the road against a quality Michigan Panther team, the Birmingham Stallions are 2.5-point favorites here on the road, headed to Detroit. CJ Marable is inactive this week. This is the first game of the week, so we do have the injury report. We do have the first inactives list of the week. Marable out for personal reasons this week. That means Ricky Person Jr. is going to be your starting tailback for the Stallions at just $6,800 here on DraftKings. Definitely want to have him, some allocation to him here as a result at a really good price with a decent floor for touches. Hopefully we get more than 3 fantasy points here in a better game script situation. But I would keep an eye on Larry Roundtree. Birmingham, Skip Holtz in this offense, they do like to use 2 running backs and kind of use them as a tandem. So these guys could probably end up with closer to a similar amount of carries in the backfield, like something like 10 each. Wouldn't surprise me in any game script situation whatsoever between Person and Roundtree. But I do think Person is the better play here as the presumptive starter, and the guy will get the first crack at it in key situations for Birmingham here in week number 2. As far as your underdog running backs, just to discuss opportunity a little bit based off of what we saw in week number 1, Nate McCrary was the clear starter for the Panthers. He was listed first on the depth chart, and he played ahead of Colburn. Well, like some of these other teams, it does look like Colburn rotated in on some passing situations and also got a couple of series to himself every once in a while. But even though the box score result wasn't there, actually scored less points than Colburn last week, I do think McCrary is probably the better play here moving forward if he's going to see more time on the field. Going to lose some of that opportunity to the quarterback, though. That's the problem with that offense. With Memphis, Deneric Prince had the majority of the touches, 10 carries, 4 targets, so he would be the next most interesting play. For Houston, Kirk Merritt's price didn't really change a tremendous amount at all. Was in the mid 6,000s last week and 6,600 last week. He actually came down $300, and he is going to see the majority of the carries in the backfield. He had 8 of the 16 team rushes last week, 50% share, and he had 4 targets in the passing game. Going to be one of the better weighted opportunity roles, and if we get a slightly more efficient game on offense from Houston, Merritt stands to benefit from that in the box score just based off of the touches and the role that he has in this offense, playing running back and running some routes out of the slot, out of the backfield. So I do think Kirk Merritt is a great tournament play as well as an underdog against Arlington. Might be the most logical player to use as a bringback with Arlington players as well, if that's something you're interested in doing here. San Antonio, John Lovett was the clear number one guy over Anthony McFarland. What was surprising, though, was that Jashaun Corbin here actually got more touches than Anthony McFarland as well. That is a rundown of the running back position this week. I think, personally, I'm going to go back to the well with Jacob Sailors in the last game of the weekend as someone I want to build around, block the field with that. And I want to probably talk a little bit more about pass catchers and quarterbacks this week. We led with Magoo and his rushing upside. I think that's relatively safe if he's going to get 100% of the snaps again here, which once again, Skip Holtz did confirm that on shows called Three Man Front, did an interview with some local Birmingham radio this week where he mentioned that he wasn't looking to make any changes here in week number 2. So we're expecting Alex Magoo to get the start once again here, hopefully more efficient. Next quarterback I'm most interested in is going to be Jordan Thomas. Now, week 1 is definitely way too early to talk about buy lows, underperforming wide receivers, because the sample size is extremely low. However, it's really juicy to look at what happened in the passing game for DC on Ta'amu's 37 dropbacks last week. Looking at the DC Defenders offensive players, Cornell Powell had 9 targets in the official box score last week, 88.2 air yards. He had just 2 receptions for 23 yards, no touchdowns. Ty Scott did have 10 targets, turned that into a 5-reception, 61-yard performance, 91 air yards. Between these two guys, they're responsible in total for 53% of team targets and just under 60% of team air yards. Each of them underperformed their opportunity. Ty Scott, with just 11.1 PPR points here on DraftKings, underperformed his expected score by 10 points. And Cornell Powell underperformed his expected score by about 14 points based off of his role in this offense. So I do think Powell, I do think Ty Scott, and I do think Jordan Ta'amu make for a really interesting double stack this week based off of the opportunity with both of these receivers seeing a tremendous amount of targets and the fact that they weren't necessarily able to convert those targets into the fantasy points that we were expecting to see in week number 1. I would assume DC is going to try to run the offense a similar way here in week number 2. And so this was probably my favorite high-risk play of the week, a DC Defenders stack. The other underperforming wide receiver from last week shouldn't come as a surprise because they didn't complete a pass in the entire second half. Deon Cain led Birmingham with 5 targets last week. Now, that doesn't seem like a tremendous amount, but he did have 51% of team air yards last week, so he's clearly the number one receiver. When we look at the routes run here as well for Birmingham, Deon Cain ran more routes than any other receiver on the Stallions by an extremely healthy amount, 27 routes in week 1. So I'd expect him to do the same here against Michigan, and hopefully what will be a more efficient game for the Birmingham offense. So those 3 guys are some of my favorite high-risk plays this week. They're underperforming their 1-week sample of opportunities. Deon Cain, Ty Scott, Cornell Powell. Your other strong plays at the position, I mean, the salaries are high for a reason with these guys. Mentioned Sal Cannella, relatively safe play in the highest implied team total offense of the week. Justin Hall, 10 targets last week. He's going to have a high floor week in and week out with Houston. Hall and Kiki Chisholm with the Roughnecks here basically played every single snap at receiver for Houston, so that makes them a pretty high floor duo in general. A lot of playing time that we can count on there, which is good to see. San Antonio, still just $4,100 here. Jacob Harris ran the second most routes at receiver for them, had 6 targets. Definitely an opportunity here as well with Kellen Mond, and has been mentioned by Mond as one of his favorite targets to look for as well. Obviously, Kirkland played every snap for them, 8 targets. He's going to be the one I think people still focus on here. But we have Jacob Harris, and then who I mentioned in last week's video, Greg Ward, also with 6 targets last week. He is interesting. Some of the top plays that we have that I have not mentioned yet, I do think I'd like to go back to the well with Davion Davis here with Birmingham. Price came up about $600. He ran the second most routes at receiver. And then we have the minimum price on Austin Watkins Jr., who was the other starting wide receiver for the Stallions, ran the third most routes. Big goose egg in the box score, just 2 targets, but was out there a healthy amount of the time for the Stallions as well. Michigan's wide receivers, Marcus Sims is going to have an extremely high floor every single week. He also plays pretty much every single snap. Malik Turner and Siaosi Mariner here also play virtually every snap at receiver for them. The difference between Michigan and Houston in terms of playing every snap is these two guys, Samson Nakua, who had the touchdown last week, and Devin Ross do rotate in occasionally as a fourth receiver, but they don't play nearly as many snaps as the other guys I mentioned. And we can still get a little bit of a pricing discount here on Turner, who's just $3,800, which is kind of nice. So that's a little bit of a rundown of the receivers that are available. To recap, I do think we can still play Magoo as our lowest quarterback here. I like Jordan Ta'amu as my favorite play at the position. I like Jacob Sailors locking in the floor at the running back position. Other running backs that are interesting to me here for tournaments, Kirk Merritt, really strong weighted opportunity upside. We've got Day Hunter, who had the most carries for Arlington last week. They're the biggest favorites against Houston. Maybe we get a little bit of regression here and get a lot more than 4 fantasy points. That would be nice to see. At pass catcher, Ta'amu's 2 top weapons, Ty Scott, Cornell Powell, my favorite receivers to consider pairing with him. And if I were to pick a secondary stack, I do like from this first game, the Birmingham Stallions. We've got Magoo. The other underperforming wide receiver on the week, we've got Deion Kane. And I'm still going to bat for Davion Davis as another option. That's going to do it for me for this video. Thanks for watching. As always, guys, we will have UFL videos every single Thursday throughout the season and the 2-week postseason that the UFL has to offer here. If you have any questions about UFL, please hit us up in our Discord. Once again, if you'd like to become a member, click subscribe to the channel and join the Discord. We're answering UFL questions all weekend long. I'll have projections for the 4 games this weekend available by Friday morning on the Discord as well. Thanks for watching this video. See you guys next week.